Welcome back. Welcome back to our next video in our series of online videos here about macroeconomics. In previous videos, we described GDP, gross domestic product. We talked about real GDP versus nominal GDP. Right? We talked about how we measure economic growth, the two ways to measure economic growth, and the reason why economic growth is important. So we know that on average the economy grows at roughly 2.5 to 3% per year, or over the long haul. But unfortunately, we don't grow at the same rate every year. The economy goes through periodic ups and downs, sort of swings of economic activity, economic good times and economic bad times, and economists refer to this idea as the business cycle. So, here's your technical definition of the business cycle. Right, alternating periods of economic growth and contraction. Right, so that's the way we define business cycles. So let's look at this graphically. Whenever you have a graph, it's vitally important that you identify what you're measuring on each of the axes before you go any further. So on the horizontal axis, this is an easy one. This is time. So, I always tell students the best way to study this is go ahead and actually write the year 1950 all the way down bottom on the left there at your point of origin, right, where the x and y axis meet, and all the way on the right, go ahead and write today's date, 2012. So that roughly 62 years there, that's time, right? So there's your horizontal axis measure. On the vertical axis, we're measuring level of real output. So real output is synonymous with real GDP. Okay, real output. So output and GDP are the same thing. Real output. So again, real GDP is gross domestic product, which has been adjusted for changes in the price level. So typically, gross domestic product, which has been adjusted for inflation. And typically, we have inflation. So there are four phases of the business cycle. Right? We have these ups and downs and peaks and valleys, so to speak. So let's look at these, and then we'll talk about our trend line. All right. So when the economy is growing, they have this all the way on the right, but they really should start with this on the left. When the economy is growing, if GDP is positive, we are currently experiencing an economic expansion. All right. So when the economy is growing, we're experiencing an economic expansion. All right. At some point, economic activity will peak out. In other words, we'll reach our temporary maximum of economic activity. All right, so there's the peak. So we start off with the economic expansion when GDP is positive, when it's growing. All right, at some point we're gonna reach our peak, and then the economy starts to contract, or GDP turns negative. So that we refer to that as a recession, when GDP is negative or the economy is contracting. Now technically, right, the technical definition of recession is that 2 quarters or longer, so 6 months or longer of a negative GDP. That's the technical definition. And then eventually we bottom out. In other words, things stop getting as bad as they've been, and we experience what's called the trough, right? Which is the bottom of the economic business cycle. And then eventually things start to pick up again, and we start a new economic expansion, right? Now these ups and downs, in other words, the economic expansions, temporary peaks, these downward economic recessions, and then trough, right, they're against the backdrop of long run average growth. So there's your growth trend line. Right? So again, if you look at that blue line, you say, okay, the economy roughly grows at 3% annually from, say, 1950 to 2010. Okay? So that would be the slope of your line, right? That would be the slope of your growth trend line. So, if you randomly chose any year between 1950 and 2010, without, consciously deciding whether that was a good time or a bad time economically for the country, you might as well guess the economy was growing at 3%, because that's the average, that's the trend, right? But unfortunately, we go through these ups and downs through the trend, right? Sometimes we're growing faster than 3%, and sometimes the economy is actually contracting, right? Now, here's one misnomer when you look at this graph, and it's done here for teaching purposes, but economic business cycles are not as smooth and well predictable as this graph would have you think. In other words, the way it's drawn on this particular graph, like each economic expansion lasts the exact same time, we get to a peak, and then a recession lasts for a certain amount of time and then turns upswing. Right? In the real world, right, varying degrees of economic activity occur around the trend line, but it's not quite as neat and tidy as this. In other words, we might have economic expansion for say 8 years, like we did from 1983 through 1991, and then have a recession. And how long was that recession? Well, that recession lasted about 18 months, and then we had another economic expansion from 92 to through 2000. So it's every economic business cycle is unique, and we cannot predict the exact length of time for an economic expansion or a contraction. Okay, we talked about this before, but durable goods and gross business investment, I should say both of these, durable goods and gross business investment tend to have a huge impact on business cycles, and we're going to talk about why that is the case in one of the next several slides. So here we have the business cycle in the United States for U.S. history going back all the way to 1930. So first, again, identify what you're measuring here. On the vertical axis here, you have the growth rate. In other words, percentage per year of growth. So that zero growth means rate. So if you went to zero, means the economy was neither growing nor shrinking, right? The economy was neither growing nor shrinking. And then this particular slide is useful because we have a dotted line there, and that's your long-term average, right? Your long-term average. Well, what was economic activity around that average? Well, here we go. Whoa, right? This looks like somebody's at the the cardiologist, and we're measuring their heart rhythms or something, right? Well, look at the period from 1930 through 1950. You had huge swings up and down, huge swings up and down. Well, this huge swing down that occurred right after 1929, obviously that's the Great Depression, right? That's the Great Depression. Things got better for a while. Now remember, if you're at the absolute bottom, any type of economic growth is going to look stellar compared to where you were. So things got better for a while during the Depression, and they got worse. Then economic activity flourished, where we were producing goods hands over fist, just like gangbusters during World War II. And then you look at this and say, oh my gosh, look what happened after World War II. Well, that's a little bit of a misconception there. Say, look at that period, it's like from 1940, say 6 to 47. The reason why the economy dropped so much is simply because we stopped producing military output. Right? Now, the most important era to analyze on this particular graph is the period from 1950 all the way through to today. Now, I know this particular graph stops at 2000, but the ideas will still apply to what I'm about to say. Modern macroeconomic thinking and the fiscal monetary policy, understanding of the business cycle, really took place from 1950 on. Right, really took place from 1950 on. So if you look at that period of time, right, it's characterized by economic activity going up and down just below the trend line. In other words, sometimes we're above the trend line, sometimes we're below it, but we don't have these radical variations like we did, prior to 1950. And most people believe that's because the government's taken a much more active role in trying to curtail the business cycle to any extent they can. Okay. Why in the world did the business cycle do business cycles occur? Right? Why do business cycles occur? Well, now that we have defined the business cycle and we used a graph to explain the 4 phases of the business cycle and the long run trend and how we grow at roughly 3% annually, and we have these ups and downs through the trend, these economic good times and bad times. Let's look at some actual data, and then we'll finalize this specific part of the lecture on the business cycle by talking about why do business cycles occur. So here's some actual data from not so far in the past economic history, U.S. economic history. So the first economic downturn here, this business slump, August 29th through 33, right? So March of 33. This was the height of the Great Depression. Not a very good time to be an American. Not a good time to really be on Earth. Most modern industrialized countries were suffering the same economic and geopolitical fate that the United States was suffering. But look what happened from 29 to 33. almost, we're touching on getting close to 4 years of economic downturn, economic recession. So the economy is in a recession for 4 years. Look at the decline in output, monstrous, 53.4%. In other words, right, think about this in today's terms. 2011 GDP, almost $15 trillion. Let's call it $15 trillion. So imagine if, 4 years from now, we were only producing $7.5 trillion worth of goods and services. Now you understand why the Great Depression was a human calamity. I mean, think of all the foregone consumption, all the economic resources not being put to use because of that Great Depression. Look at the peak in the unemployment rate during the Great Depression. A quarter of the workforce was unemployed. 1 out of 4 people could not find a job. Right now, things started to get better for a while, and then we fell right back into a tremendous recession from May of 37 through June of 38. Another 13 months, another 32.4% decline in economic output, and unemployment got 1 in 5 people, 20% of people were without a jobs. Right? Okay, let's look at some more recent U.S. economic history let's look at some more recent economic data. All right, here's the data for the most current recessions in the United States. We left out actually the mild recession in 2000, but we have let's particularly focus on 3 recessions. Let's focus on the November 73 through March 75 recession, which lasted 16 months and saw a 14.7 decline in GDP or output, and unemployment got as high as 9%. Right? Well, what caused that particular recession? Well, that recession was caused principally by an increase in the price of oil. We're going to look at cost-push inflation. We're going to define inflation and talk about the reasons why inflation occur in a future in a future lecture. However, for now, let's just sum this up by saying, at that point in U.S. economic history, the United States was much more dependent on manufacturing for its economic well-being, and when the price of oil skyrocketed, it put a huge dent in the economy. Right? Then we had another significant recession from 81 to 82. It lasted 16 months. Right? Pretty good drop, 12.3% drop in output, 10.8% unemployment rate. Well, that was sort of like this along the same lines. We never seriously recovered from that other recession in the 70s. Right? Now, how about the Great Recession? Well, it lasted 14 months from December of 07 to March of 09. The latest estimates, I just actually looked this up on Bloomberg, is that the percentage decline in output was 4.1%. Right, for that period, total decline of 4.1%. And unemployment actually did get above 10% to 10.1%. To 10.1%. Now, why do business cycles occur? Why do business cycles occur? Now that we've defined the business cycle, we've sort of talked about the 4 phases of the business cycle. We talked about the long run trend and the ups and downs through the trend. The idea that over time we sort of grow at an even keel, but we have these random periods of ups and downs. Well, the first one is random periods of innovation. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, if you think about it over time, go back to the beginning of the modern industrialized economy. Go all the way back to say the factory or the steam engine, so to speak. And we've had these inventions which have had significant impacts on society and particularly on economic activity. So whether it's the steam engine or the factory or the assembly line or something more modern, now it's not going to sound terribly modern, but something like the railroad and then the airplane. And you can really identify with the following one is the computer technology innovation which took place in the early 90s. I mean, that was the driving force for the economy from say 1990 through 2000. For the first time in global history and particularly U.S. economic history, we figured out a way to incorporate these new powerful mathematic machines called computers and how we could use them in the economic process. So a superior increase in technology and productivity brought on by computers. So these things don't happen in nice orderly fashion. In other words, we don't know what the next type of innovation is going to be which will affect the economy to a great deal. Right? There's something around the road. And my predictions here, probably wish I could make some money off this prediction, is it's definitely going to be something with alternative energies, or at least some different way that we produce and consume energy. Whether that's a fuel cell, a hydrogen fuel cell, or some type of just magnificent discovery like cold fusion. But when that takes place, it's definitely going to change not only the economic landscape but the geopolitical landscape. And that leads us to our next one, right? The geopolitical events. You think about how wars and strife have affected economies. Europe and the United States have not been in a serious war since World War II. So even though we've had some recessions, we haven't had perfect economic activity over that period from say 46 or 47 through today. The fact that we've been relatively at peace, especially at peace with each other, the Americans and the Western Europeans, right? That's definitely led to a better economic picture. We look at some of the poor countries in Africa which have suffered through the geopolitical events of leaderships not really caring about their people. You can see how that affects countries' economies. Right. Now this is one that we love to talk about, asset bubbles, whether these are financial assets or actually physical assets. So go back to the year 2000, we had the dot-com bubble, right? We had all these stocks associated with these internet companies and this new technology. They were all supposed to be free from any type of risk. They would go on, they were continuing to go up forever, and unfortunately Americans piled into them in droves, and then of course the whole thing came collapsing down. So there's a recent asset bubble. Right now, this is the one we probably don't want to talk about much because it's been hurting the U.S. economic activity since 2006/7. Right, the financial industry and these mortgage-backed securities and derivative instruments built on top of these. So for lack of a better way to explain this, basically a pyramid scheme of financial instruments which all came crashing down. And tied to that is not only a financial asset but a physical asset, the housing markets. In other words, the value of a physical asset, your house, the value of houses across the country fell somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40%. Of course, housing is very geographic as far as the location, but that's definitely what contributed to the current recession we are experiencing from say 2007 through 2010. Right. The last one is one that we're going to talk about because it's important to understanding economic business cycles, and it will be worthwhile to talk about when we start talking about monetary and fiscal policy. Right. Durable good purchases and gross business investment by small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and large businesses. So people like you and I, households, we buy big ticket items sometimes, right? So we buy that new refrigerator, that new washing machine, right? The new furniture for our house. And these are typically costly expenditures. Sometimes we actually finance them, right? So though that type of spending tends to drive economic activity. And then gross business investment, or investment spending by businesses on new capital. So you can sort of follow the dots here, or just trace the picture from point A to point B to point C. When a company buys and installs new machines, obviously they need people to run those machines, right? So anytime a company purchases a new piece of capital, right, that investment spending, right, that machine has a multiplied effect on economic activity because, number one, they put an order into another company, so that company got an order. Number two, in general, companies do not replace or refurbish equipment unless there's a demand for the good they're producing or the services they're providing. Right? So increases in durable good purchases and investment spending by businesses tend to increase economic activity and drive economic expansions. And obviously the opposite is true. Decreases in durable good purchases and investment spending by businesses tend to drive us more towards recession.